They came like shadows, silent, fast, without a single wasted word. Within minutes, the hotel no longer belonged to its guests. It belonged to them. People sat frozen in the hallways, clutching their suitcases. Children cried quietly. Phones charged at full, eyes desperately searching for a signal. But within these walls there was no help. Just the cold steel of locked doors. I did nothing. I sat on the floor by my room listening to their voices, steady, commanding, dripping with confidence. Every word felt like a stone thrown into still water. They spoke of rules, of time limits, of where each guest could move. One of them took the administrator's chair in the lobby, sitting like it was his throne. The others laughed, puffing on cigarettes as if this was nothing more than a casual overnight stay. But behind their arrogance I saw something else, a fragile, cracking mask. They were organized, yes. But organization breaks easily when nerves begin to tremble. And I saw those nerves hidden behind the bravado. The leader, the one in the chair, was bold only when his men were around. Alone, his voice shook, his eyes darted nervously. The second, younger with a tattoo on his neck, couldn't stop fidgeting, always checking his pockets. The third, a silent giant, looked like their muscle, listening more than speaking. That's when the plan began to form. Not from anger. From cold, calculated clarity. If I wanted to get out alive, I had to force them to reveal their weaknesses. I had to make them believe they were still in control, while quietly building a trap out of their own words. The first step was simple: observe. I memorized their routines, who guarded the bar, who stepped outside to smoke, what codes they used in conversation. I recorded snippets of their voices on my phone. I noted which security cameras worked and which were blind. The second step: make their shadow visible. I didn't want a direct confrontation. I wanted their arrogance turned into exposure. Publicity. And publicity is what they feared most. Witnesses, recordings, evidence. I found an ally, a cleaner. Not with money but with a promise. Help me for just one night. She slipped me a key to an unused storage room. Inside it was dark and quiet. Dusty. But there was something useful, an old portable speaker. Cracked, barely working, but it was enough. That speaker would become my weapon. I gathered what I had: short recordings of their threats, a few names they carelessly let slip, their drunken laughter. I edited them together into short loops, enough to sound like whispers of betrayal. Enough to make them ask themselves, who else heard this? Who's listening? Late at night, I carried the speaker into the storage room, hands trembling, steps careful as a predator stalking prey. I set it near the vent, connected my phone, and slipped back into the shadows of the hallway. My heartbeat pounded as I pressed play. At first, silence. Then, low laughter, fragments of their own voices. Who else knows? Don't say his name. Keep it quiet. The echoes played in loops, bouncing down the corridor like ghosts. The effect was immediate. They froze. The leader stood up sharply, barking orders. The tattooed one checked his pockets frantically, eyes darting around. The giant stalked off toward the vents, searching for whoever was spying. Their control cracked. They thought someone was listening. They thought their secrets were leaking out. While they scrambled, I sent an anonymous message to the hotel's guest group chat. The ones holding you hostage tonight should know, recordings exist. Police are already receiving them. It would be smarter to surrender. I hadn't lied about the recordings. They were real. I just gave them an audience. The leader's mask slipped further. His words lost weight. His men began arguing, whose fault it was who had slipped up. Fear spread between them, subtle but contagious. And then it happened. The tattooed one made the fatal mistake. In a heated argument he shouted a name. A name I had already caught on my recordings. A name connected to something bigger than this one night. That one word broke their illusion of control completely. The police moved in quietly, their steps echoing through the lobby. There was no gunfire, no dramatic standoff. The men surrendered. Not because they were brave but because their power had already crumbled. Their own voices had undone them. When it was over, I sat against the wall, finally breathing freely. The flashing lights from the lobby cut through the night. What began as a peaceful vacation, twisted into a nightmare, had ended not with violence, but with truth. Sometimes the sharpest revenge isn't striking back with force. It's turning someone's fear into their downfall. The police cleared the lobby before dawn. Officers moved with careful, practiced steps. Not the flashed bravado you see in movies but methodical work. Statements, fingerprints, careful recording of everything. They asked questions, collected my phone with the recordings, and took the cleaner's testimony. I watched them work and felt a strange, heavy relief, like a bandage finally coming off. But relief was not the same as victory. Later that morning the hotel was quieter than usual, but the silence felt thin, like paper stretched over a hole. Guests whispered in clusters, swapping versions of the same night. The manager paced with a permanent frown. Reporters, who had arrived as word spread, circled politely, waiting for an official statement. The police told us only what they could, that arrests had been made, that more inquiries were ongoing, that some of the men had previous records tied to small-time rackets. They asked if anyone else had recordings. A few hands went up. I handed over my phone without drama. The recordings were grainy, imperfect, but they were theirs. Their voices. Their arrogance. Enough to start threads. Days passed. The story moved from immediate fear into paperwork and interviews. The TV folks aired short segments. Social feeds filled with outrage and sympathy. The hotel offered upgrades and refunds to shaken guests. For a while the world seemed balanced again. But beneath the surface, a different truth started to reveal itself. The men in the lobby weren't random street thugs looking for quick cash. They had purpose. In the police reports, an odd pattern emerged. Small-time arrests linked to a single recurring phone number, coded messages that popped up in cash-for-service corners of the city, a network that used hospitality venues as temporary shelters, testing which locations had weak security and complacent staff. It wasn't just chaos. It was scouting. That detail chilled me more than the night itself. If they were scouting, they would adjust. They would learn. They would come back different if they wanted to continue. And the thought of them learning from us made me sharpen again. I didn't wait for them to change. I started to move. First, I embraced the quiet reality of work. I sat with the detective handling our case and went through everything I'd recorded, memory by memory. I gave him names, times, small patterns I'd noticed. The way the tattooed man tapped his fingers 3 times before speaking. The leader's habit of referencing a third drop when nervous. The detective listened with patient interest and then said something that surprised me. "You did good work. You gave us things we can follow up on." We began working together. He had access to databases the press didn't, to phone logs and pawnshop records. I had street-level instincts and a growing network of people who were tired of being preyed on. Together we started to stitch a picture larger than the one night. The cleaner who'd helped me was more courageous than she looked. After the arrest she came forward, nervous but determined. She told us about a van she'd seen near the back alley the week before, a rusty vehicle with a logo that looked fake. She described its driver. That driver, when tracked through CCTV, had led to a cheap storage unit on the edge of town. I volunteered to help investigate the unit. It felt dangerous in the sterile way danger sometimes does, a bubble of adrenaline inside a cage of procedure. The detective arranged for a formal inspection and asked me to be there as witness. Inside the unit, the smell of dust and plastic was thick. Boxes were stacked with care. In one corner, under a tarp, were crates of cheap electronics, a handful of pre-printed slips, and a ledger scrawled with odd codes and names. The ledger was the key, a ledger with routes, drop-off times, pawnshop names, even notes about which hotel lobbies had soft staff. We took it all. It was a small haul, but it was a line through the web. The detective smiled a tired smile and said, "We have a handle now. This goes to the DA." But evidence and arrests don't always stop an entire machine. They slow it. They make it stumble. Machines adapt. I wanted to make sure the adaptation would find no purchase. I started talking to the hotel staff more, not just the manager but the quiet people who rarely get attention. The night auditor who counted keys, the maintenance guy who knew all the blind spots, the concierge who handled delivery notes. Together we mapped vulnerabilities. Where cameras were old, what doors locked weekly, which shift changes left the front desk unmanned for 10 minutes. We installed small, sensible changes. An extra camera facing the back entrance, a system for immediate texting between night staff, a directory of registered guests that included short confirmations of identity for any after-hours visitors. The management pushed the policy outward. Any third-party delivery without ID would be refused. They posted clear signage about security. It was ordinary work, the kind that doesn't look heroic, but it made the building harder to exploit. That week, the local paper ran a longer piece. The headline called us a community that fought back. People sent messages, offers to volunteer, to donate to a small fund for staff training, to replace old locks. A neighbor business offered to let the hotel staff use a private phone line if needed. The momentum was quiet but real. And yet, myself, I felt the static of unfinished business. Arrests had been made, but a name kept surfacing in grainy, offhand references. A middleman who bought larger ticket batches before the cons were broken down into smaller sales. We had the van, the storage unit. We had ledgers. But we didn't have the man who hid in plain sight, the one who moved money through old accounts and used small-time thugs as his foot soldiers. I started to follow a different thread: payments. The ledger's scrawled account numbers, when checked by the detective, led to a shell account that funneled into a legitimate-sounding business. A courier company registered to a small office downtown. I called the company casually, posing as a client with a delivery problem. The receptionist was polite but evasive. I pushed gently. Could I come by? The receptionist stammered, then gave an address. The office looked legal enough. A strip of cubicles, a receptionist with a headset, packages stacked in a corner. Yet something in the way the manager avoided eye contact told me this was not a simple business. I asked about the driver names. One name in particular made a man's face go white, the same name I'd heard in the ledger and in the arrested men's mutters. He finally admitted, reluctantly, that a subcontractor had used their address as a drop. He offered a name: Pavel. I'd heard that name before, a whisper in the chaos. Pavel, it turned out, was not flashy. He was careful, thin, precise, the kind who hides in spreadsheets and phone numbers. But he had a weakness that our earlier subjects lacked. He underestimated people who'd been pushed too far. He didn't expect patience to be a weapon. Under the detective's watchful coordination, we prepared a controlled sting. We leaked the existence of a large, supposedly legitimate ticket batch, enough to tempt someone like Pavel to surface. The bait worked exactly as planned. He reached out, discreetly, through the kinds of channels he knew best. When he showed up at the arranged location, it wasn't with fists or bravado, but with paperwork, a rigid smile, and a stack of excuses. This time the arrest was precise. No dramatic chase, just the satisfaction of seeing the web finally folded in on itself. When Pavel's phone was opened, the threads were there. Messages, payment confirmations, and references to hotels marked as soft. He had been the accountant of chaos. With him in custody, the skeleton of the operation lay exposed. The DA pursued charges on a scale that made the headlines finally match the horror of that night. The men in the lobby were part of a network, yes, but networks are brittle when the right beams are removed. Months later, the hotel had a small plaque in the lobby, a quiet note of thanks to staff and guests who had kept calm, helped, and given testimony. I'm not ordained to be proud of my role. It was a series of choices, small and careful, that added up to a result. I thought often of the cleaner who gave me the key and the detective who took my recordings seriously. The work wasn't mine alone. On a clear afternoon, I walked past the spot where I had sat pinned between fear and action. A family laughed on the steps, a bellhop joked with a guest, and the normal rhythm of coming and going felt solid. The price of the night's terror was not erased. Scars don't simply vanish, but there was a kind of justice. The arrogance that had stormed through our quiet had been met with patience, with evidence, and with steady people who refused to look away. When the case was finally closed in court, sentences were handed down. Some men received time for what they had done. Others were offered rehabilitation programs when their level of involvement was lesser. The ledger's names rolled into a list of convictions. The shell accounts were frozen. The van's registration sat in a police impound lot, a small symbol of the chain broken. I didn't celebrate. I mostly slept. I started to travel again, keeping a small recorder on my phone but no longer carrying the weight of a single night like a stone in my chest. Occasionally, I would hear from guests who had been there, messages of thanks, of how they felt able to relax again. That meant more than any headline. And in the quiet moments when the past felt nearest, I would take out my phone and listen to the last clip I'd kept. Not the triumphant one where officers knocked on the door, not the one edited for the paper, but a softer piece. A snippet of a voice, surprised, admitting a name. It was a small sound. It was enough. Months passed since the arrests, but inside me there was still no peace. Justice in the courtroom was one thing, necessary, official, even respectable. But it was not enough. Not for the sleepless nights. Not for the fear that still crept into the corners of my dreams. The scars the bandits had left weren't just on the hotel, or on the people they terrorized. They had left a scar on me. And scars demand answers. One evening after work, the detective called me in. He told me something the newspapers didn't print. Not all of them were behind bars. Some of the foot soldiers had flipped on Pavel, cutting deals. Others had slipped away, vanishing into nearby towns. The case is closed, he said, but the story isn't over. That was all I needed to hear. I started watching again. I went to the storage unit site at night, walked the alleys where the van used to park, followed whispers in bars where criminals bragged too easily. Slowly, a picture sharpened. A handful of men, the ones who'd threatened guests in the lobby, were still trying to make moves. No longer bold but desperate. They were looking for money, for ways to rebuild what Pavel's arrest had shattered. I decided they would rebuild nothing. The plan came together like a shadow. I rented a small room across from the cheap club they now used as a hangout. I watched their patterns, their routines. They laughed over beer, played cards, argued about their next steps. They didn't know they were being studied. Every night I wrote details. Who always carried a weapon. Who drank too much and lost focus. Who left early to meet contacts. Patience became my weapon again. And then one night I struck. It wasn't a gunfight, not some Hollywood spectacle. It was smarter. Cleaner. I leaked their location, their plans, to the very people they had once tried to scam. Angry victims, bar owners, small dealers who had been cheated. A message here, a photo there, recordings sent from an anonymous account. I turned their own arrogance into a noose. Within days, their allies turned into enemies. The foot soldiers were suddenly unwelcome everywhere. Doors shut. Debts were called in. A fight broke out in their own club, leaving one of them crawling out with a broken arm. The network they tried to rebuild collapsed from the inside. And then came the final piece. I waited until the night they were most desperate. I knew it from their angry shouting, from the way they packed bags and argued about leaving town. That night I made my move. I left them a message on the table of their club, slipped under the deck of cards they always used. Just one sentence, handwritten. Remember the hotel? The color drained from their faces when they saw it. They realized someone had been there all along, closer than they imagined. They left the city that very night, running like rats from a sinking ship. Some were caught days later on the highway by police, others simply disappeared. But none of them ever came back. The hotel lived again. Guests filled the lobby, children laughed by the fountain, staff smiled with new confidence. The plaque on the wall wasn't just a token anymore, it was a reminder that the building had survived, that people had fought back. As for me, I finally checked out. But not quietly. I stood in the lobby one last time, watching families wheel their suitcases past the polished floor where once men with guns had stood. I remembered the fear, the anger, and then the victory. Walking out into the sunlight, I felt something shift. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even relief. It was closure. The kind only earned when you've taken back what was stolen from you. They thought they had ruined my vacation. They thought they could use fear to own us. Instead, they taught me patience. They taught me precision. And in the end, they taught me how to destroy them. The story didn't end in that hotel. It ended with my revenge.